Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Good morning.
Hi, this is Chip Coldren from Governor State University, and I'm on staff with the CNA group who is working with BJA on the Smart Policing Initiative. Welcome this morning. This is a webinar that will be presented by Scott Decker on the role of research in smart policing initiatives. I just want to open up a few words by way of background and introduction. Interestingly today, if everybody who said they were going to sign up signs up, we'll have about 60 individuals from 26 different locations around the country. So this webinar is very well attended. We have well over 20 or 25 of the smart policing sites represented, so that's very encouraging. I think it's indicative of the fact that we all understand how important it is to integrate research into smart policing initiatives. I'll come back to the topic in a minute. I did want to welcome everybody on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, who has been sponsoring the Smart Policing Initiative for several years now. As most of you know, this webinar is one of a series of webinars we've been putting on for the past year or so. They are largely driven by site interest and site suggestions. We get those suggestions primarily through the webinar evaluations that we email to you after the webinar is completed. So, as I always do, I encourage you to pay close attention to that and to give us any suggestions that you have, either regarding how to present them or what other topics you would find interesting and helpful. Right now, we're in the process of reviewing the past several evaluations, and we have a fairly hefty list of recommendations that we're working on. So your comments and your recommendations do make it into a decision-making process somewhere, that's for sure. I wanted to say a few other things. As I think most of you know, these webinars are recorded, so we can offer them on our website, and others can view them at their leisure. So just be mindful of your language and what to say. We also have a chat room function, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. When we have a group this large, even though we offer several opportunities for discussion and interaction during the webinar, typically not everybody has a chance to get all their questions in. So we encourage you to submit your comments and questions through the chat room, and we at CNA and SPI will respond to everybody's questions and comments in one way, shape, or form. Other than that, I just want to say again that we're all realizing, even more than we did a while ago, how important it is not just to have a research partner in a smart policing initiative, but to have a well-integrated research partner. Someone who's part of the team, someone who's comfortable helping make decisions, not just standing on the side, collecting data and delivering the news. So Scott Decker, who has been with us since the beginning from Arizona State University, is going to talk about the role of the researcher in smart policing initiatives and how important it is and what good results come from a well-integrated research partner in smart policing. Scott, as always, I appreciate your time and the effort that you put into these webinars. I gladly turn this over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chip, and welcome everybody. This is certainly a topic that I've seen have considerable importance over the years in projects that involve teams that are focused on problem solving. And it's an area that can really enhance and make a project better, but it's a difficult one to do. I should say right from the start that this is a somewhat untraditional role for researchers to play. Many researchers are uncomfortable when a team member, a police chief, a lieutenant, a probation supervisor, someone in parole, a community member turns to them and says, okay, what would you do? It really puts a researcher on the spot, and I think it's an important role that can be more effective if there are certain lessons or practices that are followed. I've seen a lot of opportunities where research has changed the game. We hear a lot of talk these days about game changers. You know, is someone in sports, is someone in government, someone in the private sector who can really change the game. A well-integrated research partner who does their job well has the potential to change the game. But as I mentioned at the outset, it can be difficult because it's not a common role for researchers to play, and also it's one that researchers aren't trained in doing very well. When I look at how we train researchers in the university, there's very little attention to the kinds of principles and practices that underscore the researcher's role in the SPI project. It's important at the start, and it ought to go without saying, but it is important to say all partners must participate in the research process. They can offer questions, they can offer suggestions for data, they can offer interpretations. The research has to play a role from the start. This is not the white coat, long white coat and white gloves model where a researcher comes in at the end and passes a report card that says, you get a B+ or you flunk. If that's the sort of role that your researcher is playing, then you haven't got the right researcher, or they're not following the right model. And I think it's important that members of the team not sit back and say, well, those researchers, they know what they're doing. We'll trust them to give us the answers, because they won't be successful if that's the approach that is used. A variety of roles researchers can play. They should identify problems, they should point out potential solutions, but they can also do something really important that I think is a role researchers don't pay enough attention to, and that's get people's attention. I'll talk a little bit about that in the slides to come. There's another role that researchers play, and it's one of those words researchers use that make people roll their eyes. It's triangulation. We often approach problems as if they're flat and one-dimensional. And if all we need to know is information from the records management system or the parole jacket or their report cards, if we combine information and data, 2, 3, 4 sources, enough so that we get multiple views of the problem, we're going to understand it better. The researcher's role in SPI is a relatively new one for most researchers. They should pose questions. They should be prepared to walk their team through the data. It's also important that they learn from the team. It's a real challenge for most researchers to keep the research practical and meaningful to the team. It's all too easy to run away with a complicated statistical model or gobbledygook explanations that don't make much sense. And I think if a researcher views their primary role as unpacking the problem, as if the problem was an onion, and one layer after the other layer was unpeeled until we got to the core of a problem, that would be a meaningful way to approach the nature of the researcher's role. Researchers need to pay attention, I think, to really 3 things. And one of the readings for today, if you will, that another SPI partner in Cincinnati, John Eck, provides some guidance here. Researchers ought to focus on the facts, who, what, when, where, the context, the surroundings, and the why in order to be as successful as possible. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that researchers can do for the team is draw attention to the problem. Many of us assume that members of the community, members of the criminal justice system, probation, parole, are going to look at a problem and just assume that's important. They're going to share our belief that everybody ought to care about this problem. That's not always the case. I've used a presentation in the slide that's up now in many times in St. Louis and for other communities that I've worked with. St. Louis, a violent city, a city with high rates of violent crime and especially homicide, and in many cases, team members just kind of treated it as sort of ho-hum, well, there's violence. And we created this slide with inspiration from John Clofus and Rochester that depicts from the bottom up the U.S. homicide rate, the U.S. homicide rate for males, the U.S. homicide rate for black males, and then the U.S. homicide rate for black males 17 to 29, which is 104 per 100,000, over 20 times the U.S. rate. And then we show that rate for St. Louis and for East St. Louis. And what I ask, as we review each of those bars in front of the team or with the media or with members of the Urban League or the public schools, is, are you mad now? Does it make you mad that the St. Louis homicide rate is over 50 times higher for young black men than the U.S. homicide rate? People get energized about that. That draws attention to it. And it also presents really the challenge. And a research partner can find a way to challenge the team to stay focused on the problem. It's all too easy to drift, for the focus of the team to drift to some new high-profile case or some new geographic target or some new problem that emerges. And if we drift away from our initial problems and problem definitions, we're less likely to be effective in doing much about them. The good news about the SPI research process is that the things we must be committed to be successful are things that we know and things we've done in the future. Certainly most police departments and probation, parole, juvenile corrections are familiar with the SARA model, the strategic problem solving, with intelligence-led policing. What SPI endeavors to do is to combine these things that we're already committed to and know, to combine them in a way with a team focus that's research-driven to be even more successful and push them to a new level. In order to do that, I'm fond of saying that research must be infused in all parts of the SPI process. And that's a real challenge for most research partners who aren't used to being called on to provide solutions and to challenge their law enforcement and criminal justice and community partners. We know the SARA model calls for 4 steps, the first of which is scanning. And it's easy to be overwhelmed at the scanning phase and say, look, there are so many problems in our community. There's so many things that need to be done. And if our attention gets partialed out into too many different areas, we're not going to be successful. One of the most useful roles a research partner can play is focus. Focus, focus, focus. Keep your eye on the ball. You remember, team, we defined our problem as they did in Reno, prescription drug abuse, or as they did in Glendale, Arizona, crimes that occurred in trouble apartments or at high-volume convenience stores. We've got to stay focused on the problem. How big is this problem? How long has it been around? How do we know that it's a problem? The researcher can keep saying that how do we know question to call attention to the data, to make sure that the problem we identify is well supported by data that we can then use to measure our progress. And we ought to take into account a variety of members of the team to assess that something that is a problem. And, you know, it's often the case that the most vocal group at the table is law enforcement. They see these problems on a daily basis, 24/7, 365. But we want to hear from the community as well. We want to know what the community sees as a problem. It's often the case, and I've never been so surprised as to go into high violent crime neighborhoods. An example from St. Louis is up on the screen now. It's a pin map, if you will, of where service calls for service to the police came for shots fired, murders, armed robbery, serious assaults, the kind of violent crimes that the police deal with on a regular basis and really get our attention. and to conduct interviews within that circle of citizens who tell us they aren't concerned about the shootings and the assaults and the murders. They're much more concerned about the day-to-day nuisance problems. They're concerned about graffiti. They're concerned about littering. They're concerned about drug sales that may ultimately be linked to those violent crime problems. And it's by using maps, for example, that everyone can understand, to put a map up in the squad room or in the hallway of a police department or probation office, and have probation officers or law enforcement officers look at the map and point to a dot and say, I remember that shooting. That was where so-and-so was shot by somebody who they had victimized before. And maps can help provoke and encourage additional conversations about the nature of our problems that can help us with that who, what, when, where, why, and set of context issues. The analysis is the area that's probably most exclusively the purview of the researcher. And here's where a good researcher can really make things, if you will, come to life for the task force. They have to ask questions about the data. What's available? Where can I go to get information? How good are the data that are available? And then the things that are really important are things like trends, patterns, relationships in the data. And here again, the triangulation word comes up. The police know their data pretty well. Probation knows their data pretty well. Groups that work with victims know victim characteristics pretty well. But many of our agencies work in silos. They're not aware of what the data look like from other groups and how their data looks like compared to other data. Here's where a researcher can really play a useful role in saying, you know, here's where probationers are, here's where parolees have come back from the state prison system into our neighborhoods, and here's where calls for service for shots fired are. What can we learn about this corner? What can we learn about the physical characteristics of neighborhoods that have these problems as shown by triangulated pieces of data, a variety of different sources of data. We've got a neighborhood map up near the famous M&M 8 Mile in Detroit that shows the concentrations of guns and drugs, in particular drug crime and homicides. But it adds an additional layer of data there that includes abandoned buildings. And guess what? We see that where we have high concentrations of abandoned buildings, drug crime and homicides tend to cluster as well. Well, that's not a surprising finding, but it draws attention to the fact that if our team is only criminal justice people and we don't have code enforcement, for example, then we're missing an important partner in addressing the nature of our crime problem. Because try as they may, arrest as they will, supervise as probation, parole, law enforcement may be, they can't do much about abandoned buildings. But if we call city code enforcement in, if we work with developers, if we encourage citizen involvement, then we have an opportunity to add a new and unique and really powerful person to our team in going ahead to try and solve our problems. And it's the role of researchers to identify those new sources of data that we can add that really increase the impact, expand the dimensions of power for our interventions. The crime triangle is certainly not new to law enforcement, not new to many of us who have worked in strategic problem solving in the past. But I think we can take the crime triangle, to a new level. The focus on offenders, what are the characteristics of offenders? Victims, what are the characteristics of victims? Have they been in trouble with the law before? Are they currently on probation or parole? Are they under some other form of supervision? And locations. When we put those three things together, offenders, victims, and locations, and talk about the data that we have, the findings that we have in front of the team, a research partner can lead the team through a process that can result in a more effective analysis, but also a broader understanding of the nature of the problems. Also the case that the researcher has an important role to play in the response end of the process as well. There are a lot of things that researchers can do to improve the nature of responses. I've seen all too often, however, researchers come in, they're engaged in the scanning, they're engaged in the analysis, and then they say to the team, okay, you all come up with the answers about what to do, I've given you all the data. Well, I think that's a backwards role for researchers to play for lots of reasons. One is, a good researcher can assist with a thorough review of best practices. I've been in any number of meetings, a dozen or more, where either I or a research partner has presented data, and the first response is, let's do scared straight. Let's get a bunch of kids to come down to the morgue, and let's take them into the jail, and let's just scare the living heck out of these kids, and then they won't do anything wrong again. A good research partner would understand the research about scared straight that shows, in spite of its well-intentioned aims, that scared straight is served to make kids worse. And the kids who go through scared straight tend to end up in more trouble because maybe they idolize or they want to emulate the people they see in the prison, or they find something cool about the morgue or an emergency room. So a research partner can steer people away from responses that don't work, that may take a lot of resources or time, but they can also keep them away from responses that have been shown not to work. It's also important for a research partner to provide interim feedback. This SPI is not something that says, let's launch the rocket and see if it hits its target, and if it misses, then we know we had the wrong response. It's important to provide mid-course corrections. This isn't an easy role for a research partner. I know this firsthand. We all like to deliver good news, and a team that we become integrated with, and maybe we're friends with, and we meet on a regular basis, and we share the commitment to being successful, to say to them, ooh, wait a minute, this isn't working. That's not an easy bit of news to deliver, but it's a very important one, because nothing's worse than for a research partner to know things aren't going the way they should be, and to keep silent about it, spend the money, spend the time, spend the effort, come to the end of the project, and then say, oh, shucks, we didn't think it was working from the start. Assessment is something important as well to focus on. And assessment is part of that regular feedback, that interim use of data to give mid-course corrections. I'm fond of saying a research partner should never go to a monthly or quarterly team meeting without some new set of findings to present and talk about. But in the end, a research partner should provide full outcome analyses. And a full outcome analysis isn't just saying crime went down. It's saying crime went down among a targeted group of offenders in a specific neighborhood compared to a matched control group of similar offenders that, all else equal, they look like the offenders we targeted. So that SPI is not just about getting through scanning and assessment and response. It's about real outcome evaluations with real control groups that would withstand peer evaluation and peer review and peer scrutiny. We know that random assignment is rarely possible in the real world of criminal justice, but good matched designs that maybe use time series or good matches of neighborhoods are important. And we've inserted a couple stop and thinks because of the volume of folks that we have on the line today. we're not going to have an opportunity to take questions during the course of the presentation. Hold them to the end, and we'll try and get through them. But our stop and think is intended, and it may be appropriate to revisit this with the team. Maybe the research partner ought to pull out the stop and think slides and distribute them at the next meeting and raise some of them. I'm a big fan of the Problem-Oriented Policing Center and their websites. If I get a call from a reporter, or if I get a call from local law enforcement, or I'm part of a team, the first thing I do is tell them, have you looked at Mike Scott's webinar on problem-oriented policing that's up on the SPI website? Have you been to the POP Center? If somebody calls me about crime in public housing, I point them right away to the crime in public housing problem-solving guide at the POP Center. And I also think that one of the real strengths of SPI is the peer-to-peer opportunity. The number of you, Chip mentioned it was 60 plus, who signed up for the webinar and who attend the meetings. I always find the discussions at the breakouts and at dinner and at the end of the day to be really productive, because there's a lot of peer-to-peer opportunity, and I think that research partners ought to take advantage of that peer-to-peer opportunity as well by talking either to some of the earlier research partners to inquire about their successes, or to each other. How are you doing this? Where else could I go and read? And certainly among the SPI team, there are a number of opportunities to talk to research partners. We've listed a couple of the areas: Glendale, Reno, Palm Beach, Philadelphia, Boston, that have had early successes. And I think one of the characteristics is that none of these sites have said, we're going to declare victory and go home, we've won the war. Vigilance and keeping on top of a problem is important. Also important that your problem might be different. You might look on this slide and say, I don't have any of these 5 problems as my SPI problem, so I don't have anything to learn from Glendale or Philadelphia or Boston. I would say it's just the opposite, that what you can learn from these partners isn't specific to their problem, but it is to their process. Because at its heart, what SPI is a process that infuses research in new ways. And there's a story to tell. I always, when I do TA with a site, I always ask, what's your story? What's your story about the nature of the problem and how you came to understand it and how data changed the game and what you did to change the nature of the problem? At its heart, the very key SBI research principle is to ask good questions about the problem. How do we know this is a problem? What do the data show? What did multiple sources of data tell us about the problem? And I think a good research partner will write the answers to these set of questions down and feed it back through a feedback loop on a regular basis, whether that's done electronically or at a meeting or with a good old piece of paper that they pass out, or as an attachment to an email, so that everybody has a dated problem statement that they can refer to 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the year, and that helps the team to focus. Finding good data to address a problem is really important. And that's one of the key tasks of a research partner. And I think it's important that research partners push beyond the standard criminal justice data that we all face. A good response has to be built on that data, but it's not sufficient just to have that data alone. So if we're dealing with a crime problem, my first source is the Uniform Crime Reports. I want to know how much of it there is. I want to know how it's changed over time. Whether you're in a UCR reporting state or a NIVERS reporting state, you have the basis to begin to discuss the nature of that crime problem. If your problem's violence, FBI also reports the supplemental homicide reports with a lot more data. You can look at computer-aided dispatch and record management systems. They can be complicated to look at, although the good news is they're getting simpler. You can conduct a homicide incident review. I think one of the most powerful sources of triangulation is to put 20 people in the room who know something about a homicide case. The probation officer, the parole officer, the ER staff, the ambulance staff, the police, the prosecutor, maybe nurses, maybe school people, maybe probation, maybe parole, and have the case presented almost as if a medical team would present grand rounds. If you've ever been in a hospital and done grand rounds on a specific case, it's a way to pull an individual case apart and learn about that individual case that can shed light on a variety of different approaches. I've been to cities that tell me, we know we've got a gang problem, but there's no gang data. And I tell them, gee, that's funny, because you've been reporting gang data to the National Youth Gang Center for the past 10 years. And I'm always surprised to find that in a police department, it's often the case that one unit doesn't know what the other's doing. And that's a job for the research partner to push out and identify more data sources. ATF trace data, local gun data, if your problem is a gun-related problem, that's very useful. I'm also a big fan of interviewing officers, asking them what they know, especially beat officers. Beat officers have a wealth of information that we never tap into. We ought to pay more attention to. Ambulance data, health data, emergency room data can all provide additional sources of information about a problem. I've been in half a dozen cities where the problem was gun crime and gone to the emergency room and found that though they're required by law, medical personnel don't report all gunshot wounds to the police. Fixing those systems in those holes and those kind of breaks in the system is something a research partner can help to do by identifying them. We also don't pay enough attention to interviewing offenders. What are they deterred by? In one city, we found that offenders were more scared, more afraid of being on the street without a gun and confronting an armed offender than they were of being caught by the police and prosecuted for a gun crime. Well, that's valuable knowledge. We've got to do something to make more salient and more realistic the threat of getting caught, and not just the probability of getting caught, but also the sanctions that might follow. And I also think that if we don't pay attention to social media, electronic data sources like Facebook, in Fresno, where my team's done over 100 gang interviews, Crush Spot is the social media source that gang members use. It's not anything I had ever heard of or known of. Moco Space is still real popular among gang members, probationers, and parolees in Los Angeles. And I know from interviews and working with law enforcement that a large volume of stolen goods are posted on eBay, Craigslist, and other such sites. I mentioned earlier the issue about, and here's a piece of data that a research partner has provided for a community. Who are you most afraid of? The penalties or running into an armed person on the street? And this slide happens to show that at least among a group of juveniles in this city, more of them are afraid of the penalties than running into an armed person, but not by very much. We come to another of the stop and thinks. And again, and I want to thank Dr. Coldren for his idea to insert these. And I think that printing them out and pulling them out from the presentation, the research partner might reasonably ask of themselves and their team, have we done these things? Do we include street-level officer interviews or focus groups? I know a community that's identified high-rate officers for seizing illegal guns and interviewed them to learn some lessons about what makes these officers more successful. That's something that a research partner can find. Or interviews in custody. Custody interviews of individuals right off the street who've recently been arrested can provide lots of sources of information. And again, I would call your attention to the peer-to-peer focus of the Smart Policing initiative and your ability to learn from people who are both at your stage, maybe starting, maybe you're at year 2, or who are a couple years ahead of you. And you can do that by submitting a question to the SPI at cna.org, going up on the SPI website, and I think it's really a useful addition to the knowledge that you can gain. The best analysis by the best and most engaged and embedded research partner is not going to be any good and not going to be of any utility unless it's presented in a way that can be relatively easily understood by practitioners and research partners. I think mapping, and we show a mapping example here from Rochester, and the takeaway from this is at the upper left-hand corner. 80% of homicides occur in a part of the city where only 20% of the city's population lives. Even a public school guy like me can say, gee whiz, we got to focus on that 27% of the city because that's where 80% of our violence is. Maps are really powerful ways to do that. We also can use case studies. The pop guides do a good example of that. We can link between cases. We can show how one case is linked to another. We can do case flow analysis. I think case flow analysis is really a useful and important technique. How does a case get from one point in the system to another? How is it the case that we have 10,000 gun assaults in a city, but we only end up with 40 or 50 federal prosecutions on gun cases? Maybe we can show where cases drop out of the system. And here's the map of Rochester that shows that 20% of the city accounts for 80% of the homicides. Research partners are also obligated, I think, by contract and by membership on the team to do an outcome analysis, to do case studies, to develop qualitative techniques. I wouldn't ignore the opportunity to interview offenders or to interview officers in the field. That can lead to a variety of important findings. I mentioned earlier that this isn't an easy role or a traditional role for research partners. In order for them to be successful, they have to be part of a team. When I go to a meeting and I learn that the team's been up for 6 months and they're just meeting the research partner for the first time, I'm concerned about how successful they're going to be. Research partners need to be integrated. In order to do that, you can't get out in front of the team. You've got to move at the speed of the team, pushing them from time to time. You've got to respect confidentiality, communicate honestly. And I think one of the things that increases the credibility of a research partner is doing ride-alongs. You may need to do only 3 or 4 in the target area. Have an officer from the team take you on a ride-along and see what it's like up front. Be in the probation office and conduct interviews. Be responsible and be accountable. We mentioned that this isn't an easy role because it's not one we do very often as research partners. So we need to demonstrate that we're part of the team and that we're accountable. And that accountability means we're going to take a look at the world through the eyes of the law enforcement officers, the probation officers, the parole officers, the school resource officers who see this problem every day. We can do some organizational analysis as well as research partners. Who's on our team? What kind of partner are they? Are they a supporting partner? Are they a sustaining partner? Or are they a strategic partner? The strategic partners are the partners that we see on a pretty regular basis. They come to the meetings every month or every other week. Maybe we get the higher-ups, the supporting partners, once a year or every 6 months. We need to know what these partners bring to the table, and they're important. The very valuable John Eck article that's one of the 3 readings that go along with this SPI webinar and is one of your resources up on the web documents how important these partners are to increase the external validity of what we do, to make sure that what we do rings true with the members of our team, but also has an impact on the offenders that we're trying to influence on the end. Here's our third stop and think, and thanks again, Chip and Vivian, for helping to put these into the presentation, and I think they're a real valuable takeaway for all members of the team. You have to ask, how many partners outside the police department are part of your team? In the end, if we make the threat of prosecution more real or effective supervision more real, we're going to be more successful. Most offenders say that it's not arrest and it's not jail or prison that bothers them the most. It's effective, high-level supervision in the community. And what that says to me is probation, parole. We often find partners from the relatives, family, loved ones, friends of offenders who want to keep these characters out of trouble, or who are sick and tired of the things that they've done to bring their families down, to increase victimization chances. So it's important to think about partners outside police and outside the criminal justice team. Also important, I think the third bullet on this slide points to the very important notion that we need to also think about involving the community. The most successful interventions are those that involve the community, because the community can help us to sustain the intervention over the long term. And I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about expectations. Expectations apply to all partners on the team. They all should be active and share information. Their decisions have to be informed by data, and it can be the research partner's job to say, hey, wait a minute, we agreed we were going to use data to inform our decision. What's the data that tells us we should do scared straight, or we should abandon our initial problem definition and move on to something else? True collaboration is easy to talk about. It's difficult to do. It only occurs over time. People have to be accountable, communicate honestly, advocate and educate about their own agency. If there was one key, I think, that would be a takeaway about expectations, it would be, for me, accountability. I never want to come to a meeting with my team or with my partners without having something new to share. I'm the research partner. That something new has to be new data, new analysis, a new way of looking at the problem, the progress, or the outcome. And if I'm not coming to a meeting with, we always say that we want to produce at least one new graph, map, or finding every week and bring them to the meetings with an interpretation for the team. If I'm not doing that, then I'm not accountable and I'm not doing my job. And we often end the meetings, the team meetings I'm involved in, by going around the room and everybody saying, okay, at the next meeting, I will have X for you to present. And somebody writes that down, and they start the meeting subsequent to that by saying, okay, research partner, you said you were going to give us a map of the problem. Let's see it and tell us what it means, and let's respond to that. Thank you for your time this morning. We'll have a little opportunity for Chip to moderate the remainder of the session. But again, I would draw your attention to the really wonderful resources that are up on the SBI website and your ability to engage, I think, the most useful resource, and that's your other collaborators in the SBI process.
Very well, Scott. Thanks a lot. I want to raise one question for you, if I might, something that's come up in some of the chat in the chat room.
Yes.
There's a comment about the role of the crime analyst in all this, and it occurs to me that we haven't talked a lot about integrating the external researcher with the internal crime analyst, and I'm well aware that different agencies have different crime analysis resources. So I wonder if you might talk just about, either from your experience or what you think is important regarding the the integration with crime analysis.
Absolutely, and a great question. Thank you for raising that. The crime analyst can be the research partner's best friend. They know, the crime analysts, they know or should know the data and how to get it and the format. They probably have the data in a format that can be used without lots of manipulation and hoop jumping through. But it also can be a tenuous relationship. The research partner shouldn't feel threatened by the crime analyst, nor should the crime analyst feel threatened by the research partner. They do different kinds of things. The research partner has the virtue of being able to take 2 or 3 steps away from the process, from being independent, because they don't work directly anyway for the police department, but they can work together, and it's likely the case in departments with good crime analysts, and historically that's been places like San Diego and Chicago and Cincinnati and Phoenix, where some of the work's already done, and a research partner working with the crime analyst can get the project up and running with a real jump start. But again, that trust and that communication has to occur between the crime analyst and the research partner, and I'm a fan of getting that relationship started very early on. Now, in some departments, crime analysis isn't as advanced as in others and won't be able to be quite as useful, but the research partner can play a useful role in kind of helping crime analysis along. Very important role, and one that can both jumpstart and push SPI to the next level.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else on the line, especially the researchers? I'm just interested in questions that you have, issues that you would like to have addressed either today or sometime in the future. What a quiet bunch.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Hey, this is Stan Savage. Thanks for the presentation, Scott. Great presentation. A question for some of those departments, particularly in some of the small and rural areas. Could you give me some comments, maybe on some best practices, particularly if research has not necessarily been one of the tools that they have looked at in terms of addressing crime, and particularly addressing crime in rural areas. Obviously, sometimes on the police side of the house, there are still some agencies that feel that you pretty much have to have a gun to be part of the solution. And although we've got a whole lot better with some of the models that you talked about, Sarah and intelligence-led policing, but for some of those departments who haven't quite got there yet, could you maybe comment on maybe some best practices and just introduce them to the whole idea of research and how that could really be a plus as they move forward?
Thank you, Stan. And we haven't solved this problem completely in the medium and the large size departments yet either. Sometimes that first meeting can be a little frosty, if not openly hostile. And again, I think some of these relationships are built over time, that research partners need to demonstrate that they have a role to play, and it's an important role, and they can do that by being accountable, by being responsive, by being a part of the team. I have found on dozens of occasions that doing a couple ride-alongs is among the best ways to show line and command staff that I'm serious about understanding what they do. And and I never pretend that because I did 2 ride-alongs that total 12 or 15 hours, I know the problems in the city and what police jobs are like. I would never want to say that. But it is a way of documenting how serious you are and your willingness to understand the world from their perspective. I also think it's valuable and important, and we can do this within the SPI framework, to say, look, in Bainbridge, Georgia, or in Kankakee, Illinois, not big departments that aren't used to integrating research. We can point to examples in other small towns or rural areas where it's been done and done effectively. So we could look here to, and indeed Kankakee is on the other side of the equation. It's a city that Chip and I've worked with, a relatively small town, that integrated research into what they do and bump their clearance rates up, reduce crime, solve problem property practices. So I like to point to where it's been successful, but at the end of the day, the most important and effective thing a research partner can do is prove their worth, show that they've got something of value to add. And I think in the rural areas, it's especially important to do that triangulation, to look for those new and different data sources. I worked with a research partner in rural Alabama, and they took this was a dozen years ago, they took their graduate students to the big box stores, and they counted the number of methamphetamine precursors available for sale in the feed and landscape stores, in the big hardware stores, in the big box stores, as a way to document how much of the materials necessary to make meth were publicly available and could be bought over the counter. I think it's important to be creative and innovative, but it's also important to build that relationship over time. It doesn't happen overnight. It can be frustrating in the first several months, but I think over time you can build allies in the police department. And one of the things you've got in a small department is, if you're working in a department the size of Philly or Chicago or LA, there's thousands of officers. If you're working in a rural department, it's easier to know and be known and to document your credibility than it is in those really big departments.
I want to make a mention. This is Chip again. We have amassed a fairly substantial group of researchers from across the country that have been involved in several different ways, probably in many different ways with different communities and different agencies. And I just want to point you and remind you to this email that we have, spi@cna.org. So if you have a question that you want to direct to Scott or to Anthony Braga in Boston or John Eck in Cincinnati or to myself, feel free to use that. We have also recently hired Mike White from Arizona as a consultant, and he's going to be primarily working with the research partners from the sites. So if there's a question that you want to direct to him or to anybody, please feel free to use that email address. We will respond very quickly. Anything else? Okay, Scott, thank you again. Very much appreciate the thought that you put into this. I think people will get a sense of not just the critical role that researchers play in smart policing, but the different roles that they play, and clearly the importance of integrating them into the team, or having them step up and integrate themselves if that's what it takes. We will for sure address other research issues in this webinar series. We have had at least one in the past on performance measurement in policing. So this isn't the first nor the last bit of information that we'll provide around the research issue in smart policing. But again, Scott, thank you very much. I know you'll be available if people have questions for you after today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. I do want to remind everybody that our capable and very competent Vivian Chu, who manages these webinar series, will be sending you an email evaluation for this session today. As I said before, please take a few minutes to respond and to let us know your thoughts and what else you think that we should be addressing. Vivian, you're on the call, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, can you please make a mention of the upcoming webinars that we have on the schedule?
Yes, we have a webinar on January 17th. That's at 1 p.m., and that's going to be on sustainability of smart policing. And the second one is going to be for our new grantee sites, and that's the 24th of January from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's going to be our kind of introduction to smart policing.
Very good. Very good. Anything else, Vivian, from you or from any of the subject matter experts on the line before we sign off?
Nope, not from here.
Okay. All right. Right on schedule, everybody. Thank you very much for your participation today. Please keep in touch.
Thank you, sir.